Karen Whitfield's carefully applied lipstick twisted into a snarl as she lunged across her immaculate lawn, still in her bathrobe, wielding a garden hose like a weapon. The high-pressure spray hit Marcus Jenkins square in the back as he was walking his golden retriever past for property. "Your dog urinated on my hydrangeas again," she shrieked, still spraying him mercilessly. "Those flowers cost me $300 each." Marcus, now completely soaked, stood frozen in disbelief. His dog, Buddy, barked frantically at the end of his leash, confused by the sudden water assault. "Mrs. Whitfield, Buddy didn't even go near your flowers," Marcus stammered through the spray. "We were just walking by." But Karen wasn't listening. At 52, she had spent the last 15 years as the self-appointed guardian of Oakwood Estates, a position that had evolved from Homeowners Association board secretary to what neighbors now called the dictator of decorative rocks. Her once charming attention to detail had metastasized into something darker, an obsession with control that had slowly consumed her life since her husband left and her children moved away. "I have it on camera," she lied, finally lowering the hose. "And I'll be submitting the footage at the next HOA meeting. That's a $1,000 fine according to bylaw 37C that I personally drafted last month." Marcus knew there was no such bylaw, but arguing with Karen Whitfield was like trying to reason with a hurricane. He muttered an apology and hurried away with Buddy, joining the growing ranks of neighbors who took elaborate detours to avoid passing her house. What Karen didn't know as she smugly coiled her garden hose was that this seemingly minor incident would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel her carefully constructed kingdom. Back inside her pristine home, Karen immediately opened her laptop to draft an all-neighborhood email about recent pet violations. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered whether to name Marcus specifically or just make a general announcement. The general announcement would reach more people, but naming Marcus would make an example of him. Her phone buzzed with a text from Diane Lowell, the current HOA president. "Emergency board meeting tonight, 7 p.m., my house." Karen frowned. She hadn't been informed of any meeting. As secretary, she was supposed to be notified of all meetings in advance. This violation of protocol sent a surge of anxiety through her chest. Emergency meetings were only called for serious matters, and serious matters in Oakwood Estates inevitably involved Karen in some way. She spent the rest of the afternoon pacing her living room, rehearsing defenses for accusations that hadn't yet been made. By the time she arrived at Diane's doorstep, 10 minutes early, clipboard in hand, Karen had convinced herself she was being ambushed. She had no idea how right she was. Karen's knuckles whitened around her leather portfolio as she sat rigid in Diane Lowell's oversized armchair. The emergency board meeting had quickly revealed itself to be exactly what she feared, a calculated attack on her authority. "This isn't personal," Karen, Diane said, though her tight smile suggested otherwise. "But we've received 17 separate complaints about the gate lock change last week." 17? Karen scoffed, though internally she was tallying exactly which neighbors would be receiving passive-aggressive holiday cards this December. The lock needed to be changed for security purposes. The old code was compromised. "By whom?" asked Tom Bradshaw, the treasurer, who had always been suspiciously friendly with Marcus Jenkins and his ilk. "I have my sources," Karen said icily, unwilling to admit she had simply wanted a new system where she controlled who had access codes. "Besides, I used my own money for the upgrade." "That's part of the problem," Diane continued, sliding a folder across the coffee table. "Architectural changes require board approval, even if self-funded, and distributing access only to certain homeowners violates our equal access statutes." Karen felt a rush of heat crawl up her neck. "I was going to distribute the codes at the monthly meeting. I was just beta testing the system with a few trusted homeowners first." "Like your sister and your hairdresser?" Tom asked, raising an eyebrow, neither of whom live in Oakwood Estates. The betrayal stung sharply. Someone must have been monitoring the gate, keeping logs of who was entering. Karen mentally added surveillance cameras to her growing list of necessary security upgrades. "The board has voted," Diane announced with the smug satisfaction of someone who had been waiting years for this moment. "You're being removed as secretary, effective immediately. We've also voted to return to the previous lock system." "You can't do that without a community vote," Karen sputtered, grasping for any procedural technicality that might save her. "Actually, we can. It's in the bylaws that you so frequently quote." Diane slid another document forward. "Section 12, paragraph 4. Board members can be removed by majority vote in cases of misconduct." Karen grabbed the bylaws, flipping frantically to Section 12. It was there, in black and white, a clause she herself had helped draft 3 years ago when ousting the previous secretary, a young mother who had committed the unforgivable sin of installing a swing set without proper approval. Furthermore, Tom added, almost gleefully, "You'll be covering the cost of reinstalling the original lock system." Karen stood abruptly, her portfolio clutched to her chest like armor. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and dangerous. I've given 8 years to this community. I've maintained property values when the rest of you were installing inflatable Christmas decorations and painting your doors unapproved colors. As she marched toward the door, Dan called after her. Oh, and Karen, the board unanimously agreed that all future architectural violations will result in a standardized fine structure. We're thinking of calling it the Whitfield Amendment. Karen didn't slam the door. That would be undignified. Instead, she closed it with such precise, controlled fury that the sound was somehow more terrifying than any bang could have been. In her car, she allowed herself exactly 45 seconds of shaking rage before straightening her spine. They thought this was the end of Karen Whitfield's reign. They were about to learn it was only the beginning. Karen's living room had transformed into a war room by midnight. Spreadsheets, community bylaws, and printed emails covered every surface, organized with the meticulous precision of someone accustomed to cataloging neighbors' violations down to the inch of grass left uncut. They think they can outmaneuver me? She muttered to her Maine Coon cat, Mr. Whiskers, who watched with indifferent yellow eyes from atop the bookcase. I practically wrote those bylaws. And therein lay her advantage. No one in Oakwood Estates had studied the HOA Constitution as thoroughly as Karen Whitfield. If there was a loophole, she would find it. If there wasn't, she would create one. The gate lock situation was merely a symptom of a larger disease, a community that had grown increasingly resistant to Karen's vision of perfection. The real problem was that she had lost control of the narrative. It was time to rebrand. Karen opened a fresh document on her laptop and typed, Community Safety Initiative. By 3 a.m., fueled by righteous indignation and 3 glasses of Chardonnay, Karen had crafted a comprehensive proposal. The Community Safety Initiative would address growing concerns about neighborhood security, concerns she would manufacture if necessary. It would require enhanced measures including but not limited to security cameras at all entrances, regular patrol services, and a new gate access system with advanced security features. The genius was in the packaging. Who could argue against safety? And if these measures happened to give Karen access to monitor who was coming and going, well, that was simply a necessary byproduct of enhanced security. But she needed allies. The board had turned against her, but the board was only 5 people. There were 67 households in Oakwood Estates, and Karen had been keeping meticulous records on each one. She pulled out her infamous neighbor dossier, a color-coded spreadsheet detailing everything from political leanings to holiday decoration preferences. Who could be manipulated? Who had their own grievances against the current board? Who owed her favors? Marcus Jenkins and his ilk were lost causes, the progressive faction, as she called them in her notes, who foolishly believed that a community could thrive without rigid structure. But there were others, the Andersons, who were still bitter about being fined for their unapproved bird bath, the Paddles, whose requests for exterior paint changes had been denied despite Karen's support, the Richardsons, whose daughter had recently had her car broken into just outside the community. By dawn, Karen had identified 17 potential allies, exactly the number of complaints that had supposedly been lodged against her. The symmetry felt like cosmic validation. She would begin with casual one-on-one coffees, subtly planting seeds of fear about neighborhood security. Then a small gathering to discuss community concerns. Finally, a petition to force a special community-wide vote. Karen smiled as she finally headed to bed, the first rays of sunrise painting her pristine white walls in shades of amber and gold. In their haste to dethrone her, the board had forgotten a crucial fact about Karen Whitfield. She had nothing but time, nothing but focus, and absolutely nothing to lose. Mr. Whiskers meowed impatiently for his breakfast. You're right, Karen conceded, pausing at the stairs. We'll need to accelerate the timeline. It's simply unconscionable, Karen said, her voice pitched with precisely the right amount of concern as she poured tea for Eleanor Anderson. 3 car break-ins last month in neighboring communities, and what is our board doing? Removing security measures. Eleanor nodded uncertainly, glancing around Karen's immaculate kitchen with ill-concealed envy. At 72, Eleanor was among the original Oakwood Estates residents, and her recent citation for an unauthorized bird bath installation still rankled. I didn't know about the break-ins, Eleanor admitted. The board is keeping it quiet, Karen whispered conspiratorially, sliding a manila folder across the counter. But I believe in transparency. Inside the folder were news clippings about break-ins in communities 15 miles away, printouts of crime statistics from considerably less affluent neighborhoods, and a carefully crafted letter of concern that only needed Eleanor's signature. By the time Eleanor left with promises to speak with her bridge club about Karen's community safety initiative, Karen had secured her first ally. The Patels came next. Arjun and Mira arrived precisely on time, their 9-year-old daughter in tow. Karen had strategically placed a plate of store-bought cookies, presented on her own serving dish, and assigned Mr. Whiskers to entertainment duty with the child. I was appalled by how the board handled your exterior paint request. Karen began, having rehearsed this opening for maximum sympathy. The shade of blue you selected was perfectly within our approved palette. I reviewed the swatches myself. Thank you, Karen, Mira said cautiously. But we've already chosen another color that was approved. Of course, Karen waved dismissively. But don't you see the inconsistency? How can we maintain property values with such arbitrary rule enforcement? By the time she circled back to her security initiative, presenting it as a way to bring structure and fairness back to community governance, the Patels were nodding along. When she suggested their daughter might feel safer waiting for the school bus with enhanced monitoring, they were sold. Karen worked methodically through her list of potential allies, tailoring her approach for each household. For the young couple worried about their investment, she emphasized property values. For the retirees, personal safety. For parents, child protection. For the environmentalists, she rebranded her initiative as sustainable security with solar-powered cameras. Not everyone was persuaded, of course. The Richardsons saw through her immediately. Lisa Richardson had been a corporate lawyer before retirement and recognized manipulative rhetoric when she heard it. But Karen had anticipated a 70% success rate, and by the end of her week-long recruitment drive, she had exceeded her target. The real stroke of genius came when she convinced Harold Winters to host a community concerns gathering at his home. Harold, with his military background and booming voice, lent immediate credibility to the proceedings. Karen made sure to position herself not as the leader, but as the concerned citizen simply providing information. The night of Harold's gathering, 22 homeowners crowded into his living room. Karen sat quietly in the corner, watching as her carefully planted seeds of fear and dissatisfaction blossomed into full-blown outrage. Harold railed against the board's negligence. The Patels shared their story of discriminatory treatment. Eleanor Anderson tearfully described feeling unsafe in her own home after reading Karen's carefully curated crime reports. When Karen finally rose to speak, presenting her initiative as the solution to their collective concerns, the room was primed for conversion. The petition she had prepared in advance received 19 signatures that night. As she drove home, a rare smile played across Karen's lips. The board had taken her title, but they had inadvertently given her something far more powerful, a cause. The monthly HOA meeting had never seen such attendance. Every folding chair in the community center was filled with latecomers lining the walls. Karen sat front and center. Her petition folder placed prominently on her lap, Mr. Whiskers, surprisingly docile, and his officially registered emotional support animal carrier beside her. Diane Lowell's gavel struck with uncertain authority. Before we begin with regular business, I understand there's a petition being circulated. Not circulated, Karen corrected, rising with the fluid confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment for days. Completed. With 39 signatures, well over the 30% required to force a special vote under Bylaw Section 8, Paragraph 3. She approached the board table, heels clicking like a metronome against the linoleum floor, and handed the folder to Tom Bradshaw rather than Diane. Small but deliberate slight. The homeowners of Oakwood Estates are formally requesting a community-wide vote on the proposed Community Safety Initiative, she announced, projecting her voice to reach the back of the room. Given recent security concerns and the board's unilateral decision to remove existing safety measures, we believe this matter requires immediate attention. Diane's complexion had taken on the pallor of someone who had just discovered their opponent had been playing chess while they were playing checkers. We'll need to review the petition for validity, she said weakly. Of course, Karen smiled. I've included a copy of each signature alongside contact information for verification purposes. I've also taken the liberty of preparing an information packet for each homeowner detailing the proposed initiative. On cue, Harold Winters and the Patels began distributing glossy brochures, paid for by Karen but branded with the Oakwood Estates logo, outlining the security initiative in terms that made it seem like the only rational choice for a community concerned with safety and property values. This is highly irregular, Diane sputtered. Actually, it's precisely regular, Karen countered. The procedure for homeowner-initiated proposals is clearly outlined in our governing documents. I'm simply following protocol. The tension in the room was delicious. Karen could feel the momentum shifting, could see the uncertainty in Diane's eyes. But she had anticipated this resistance, had prepared for it. Since the board seems hesitant to address legitimate security concerns, Karen continued, her voice taking on a regretful tone. Perhaps the homeowners here tonight would like to hear about the 3 break-ins that occurred in neighboring communities last month, or the suspicious persons several residents have reported seeing near our playgrounds. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The suspicious person had been a college student delivering food, and Karen knew it, but the seed of fear had been planted. Marcus Jenkins stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the growing murmurs. This is fear-mongering plain and simple, he declared. I've checked with local police. There's been no significant uptick in crime in our area. Karen had been waiting for this, With all due respect, Mr. Jenkins, not all incidents are reported to police, and are we supposed to wait until something happens before taking preventative measures? The debate that followed was heated, with the room clearly divided. Karen welcomed it. Conflict meant engagement, and engagement meant people would vote. She had done the math. She only needed a simple majority to win. As the meeting adjourned, with the board reluctantly scheduling a special vote for the following month, Marcus approached Karen, his expression grim. "I know what you're doing," he said quietly. "This isn't about security. This is about control." Karen met his gaze steadily. Perhaps, she conceded with surprising candor, but when the vote passes, and it will pass, I'll have done more for this community's safety than anyone else on that board. What Karen didn't know was that Marcus had left the meeting early for a reason, and that reason would soon threaten everything she had so meticulously set in motion. Karen's doorbell rang at precisely 7:15 a.m., an hour when only the most urgent of matters would justify such an intrusion. Through her peephole, she spotted Diane Lowell and Tom Bradshaw standing on her porch, their expressions grave. Behind them stood a woman Karen didn't recognize, clutching what appeared to be a leather portfolio not unlike Karen's own. She considered not answering, but curiosity overcame caution. Karen opened the door exactly 3 inches, security chains still in place. "This is highly inappropriate," she began. "Board business should be conducted through proper channels, not on my doorstep at dawn." "It's about your petition," Diane said flatly, "and certain discrepancies we discovered." Something in Diane's tone set off alarm bells. Karen unlatched the chain with reluctance, allowing them entry while mentally cataloging where she had stored all petition-related documentation. The unknown woman extended her hand. "I'm Michelle Rodriguez, private investigator. The board hired me to verify certain aspects of your security claims." Karen's stomach tightened, but her face remained impassive. "The board has no authority to spend HOA funds on private investigators without community approval. That's a violation of fiscal responsibility statutes." "Actually," Tom interjected, "this was funded personally by several concerned homeowners, and what Ms. Rodriguez discovered is quite fascinating." Michelle opened her portfolio, extracting several documents. "You distributed crime statistics suggesting a 40% increase in residential burglaries in surrounding communities over the past quarter. However, the official police records show an 8% decrease." Karen's mind raced. She had created those statistics from various sources, selectively interpreting data to support her narrative. A technically inaccurate but effective strategy she'd never expected to be scrutinized. Furthermore, Michelle continued, "the suspicious person reports you referenced were investigated and determined to be a registered food delivery driver who has filed a harassment complaint after being photographed repeatedly while working." "I never claimed to verify every rumor," Karen deflected. "I simply reported community concerns." "But that's not all," Diane cut in, her voice steely. "Several homeowners whose signatures appear on your petition claim they never signed it or were misled about what they were signing." This, Karen knew, was a direct hit. She had indeed taken certain creative liberties with the petition. Eleanor Anderson had signed a letter of concern that Karen later attached to the petition. The Richardsons' signature had been repurposed from a previous community garden proposal, and there were others, carefully selected from those least likely to attend meetings or verify their involvement. "These are serious allegations," Karen said, stalling for time. "I'll need to review the specific signatures in question." "We thought you might say that," Tom replied, sliding forward a formal-looking document. "This is a cease and desist order. Until the validity of your petition can be verified, all actions related to your so-called security initiative are suspended." Karen's carefully constructed facade cracked slightly, a flush of anger coloring her cheeks. "This is a witch hunt. You've been looking for ways to undermine me since the lock incident." "Speaking of which," Michelle added, extracting one final document, "I also investigated the gateway lock replacement. Interesting that you claim the previous system was compromised when records show you personally requested the code changed 3 times in the month prior, each time accidentally sharing the updated code with non-residents." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Karen had never imagined anyone would connect those dots, would dig that deeply into her machinations. "I think we're done here," Diane said, rising. "A special meeting has been called for tomorrow evening to address these findings. I suggest you prepare a response." As they left, Karen remained seated, utterly still except for her fingers, which tapped a rhythmic pattern against her thigh. A nervous habit she thought she had abandoned decades ago. Her gaze drifted to a framed photograph on her mantel. Karen at last year's Community Awards ceremony, receiving recognition for outstanding contribution to neighborhood beautification. She had been genuinely proud that day, convinced her efforts were appreciated, necessary. For the first time in years, Karen Whitfield faced a discomforting question. What if she was wrong? The community center buzzed with tension as Karen entered precisely 3 minutes before the special meeting was scheduled to begin. She had spent 24 hours strategizing, alternating between righteous indignation and pragmatic damage control. In the end, she had settled on a hybrid approach, acknowledged minor procedural errors while doubling down on the substance of her concerns. All conversations ceased as she walked to her usual front row seat, chin held high despite the weight of dozens of stares. Mr. Whiskers, sensing the gravity of the situation, remained unusually subdued in his carrier. Diane called the meeting to order with uncharacteristic solemnity. We're here to address serious allegations regarding the Community Safety Initiative petition submitted by former Board Secretary Karen Whitfield. Objection to characterization. Karen interrupted immediately. I voluntarily stepped down from my position to pursue community advocacy without conflict of interest. Several audible scoffs echoed through the room, but Karen pretended not to hear them. Michelle Rodriguez presented her findings methodically, displaying enlarged documents on a projector screen that made Karen's manipulations seem even more egregious when magnified to that scale. The falsified crime statistics, the misappropriated signatures, the deliberately manufactured security threats. When Michelle finished, Diane invited Karen to respond. Karen approached the podium with measured steps, placing her prepared statement before her. But as she looked up at the faces of her neighbors, people she had lived alongside for 15 years, people whose garden gnomes and holiday decorations and paint choices she had policed with such fervor, something unexpected happened. She saw them not as violators of community standards, but as people. Eleanor Anderson, who had lost her husband last year and found comfort in feeding the birds that visited her unauthorized bath. The Paddles, whose daughter had hand-painted the mailbox Karen had reported for non-conforming ornamentation. Marcus Jenkins, whose dog Buddy had provided companionship to neighborhood children after the community playground equipment was deemed a liability risk and removed largely due to Karen's advocacy. She began, then faltered, the carefully crafted defense suddenly feeling hollow in her mouth. She glanced down at Mr. Whiskers, who blinked up at her with what she could have sworn was judgment. The statistics were manipulated, she admitted abruptly, the words escaping before she could reconsider. And some signatures were proposed without explicit consent. A collective gasp rippled through the room. But she continued quickly. The underlying concern for community well-being was genuine. Perhaps my methods were flawed, but my intention was to create a safer environment for all of us. By lying, by forging signatures. Marcus called from the back of the room. By making us feel unsafe in our own community so you could swoop in as the savior. Karen gripped the edges of the podium. I believe I was acting in the community's best interest. No, Diane said firmly. You're acting in Karen Whitfield's best interest, as you always have. That's not fair, Karen protested, though a small voice inside her whispered that perhaps it was perfectly fair. Tom Bradshaw stepped forward. The board has prepared a formal response to these findings, he announced, distributing a document to those present. We are nullifying the petition and issuing a formal censure against Ms. Whitfield for ethics violations. Karen scanned the document with growing dread. The censure would permanently bar her from holding any HOA position. A humiliating public rebuke that would follow her as long as she lived in Oakwood Estates. Furthermore, Tom continued, we will be reviewing all bylaws and amendments introduced during Ms. Whitfield's tenure for potential revision or removal, starting with the excessive fine structure for minor violations. This struck at the heart of Karen's legacy. Years of carefully crafted rules, all potentially undone. You can't just erase everything I've built, she said, her voice rising despite her best efforts at control. The property values in this community have increased 15% above market average because of the standards I helped establish. And at what cost? Marcus countered. A community where neighbors are afraid to wave hello because they might get cited for excessive hand gestures. Unexpected laughter rippled through the room, puncturing Karen's remaining dignity. This meeting will now move to a vote on the censure, Diane announced. All in favor? Hands rose across the room, a forest of rejection that Karen could not bear to count. Even Eleanor Anderson, whom Karen had considered an ally, raised her trembling hand after a moment's hesitation. Opposed. Karen raised her own hand defiantly, but it stood alone. The censure passes, Diane declared, her voice softening slightly. Karen, we appreciate your years of service, but this community needs to heal from the environment of fear and control you've created. As the meeting adjourned, Karen remained frozen at the podium, watching as neighbors gathered in small groups, their expressions a mix of relief and lingering discomfort. No one approached her. No one met her eye. She gathered her belongings with mechanical precision, dignity her only remaining possession of value. But as she turned to leave, she found her path blocked by Marcus Jenkins and his golden retriever. Karen, he said quietly, his expression not unkind despite everything. This isn't the end of the world, just maybe the end of a chapter. She stared at him, searching for mockery but finding none. Buddy wagged his tail cautiously, a peace offering Karen wasn't sure she deserved. I don't know how to live here now, she admitted, the words barely audible. Maybe, Marcus suggested gently, that's something you could figure out with a little help from your neighbors. 6 months after what Oakwood Estates residents now referred to as the Karen confrontation, a moving truck was not an unusual sight on Magnolia Lane. Several families had relocated following the HOA restructuring, some unable to adjust to the more relaxed governance, others simply ready for a fresh start elsewhere. What was unusual was seeing Karen Whitfield directing the movers with uncharacteristic patience as they carried furniture not out of her home, but into it. Careful with that bookcase, she called, wincing slightly as the corner scraped her doorframe. The previous owners left it in pristine condition. Karen wasn't moving out. She was renovating, transforming her formal living room into something she'd never had before, a proper home office. The community censure had forced a reckoning Karen hadn't anticipated. Barred from HOA involvement and suddenly facing long, empty days without committee meetings and violation reports to fill them, she had reluctantly accepted a lunch invitation from Marcus Jenkins. A peace offering she suspected was born more from pity than genuine interest in her company. That lunch had led to an unexpected revelation. Marcus was a partner at a property management firm specializing in community governance consulting. You know more about HOA regulations than anyone I've ever met, he had admitted between bites of Kaiser salad. Your methods were questionable, but your knowledge is undeniable. 2 more lunches and a surprisingly candid conversation about her career aspirations later, Karen had submitted her resume. The irony wasn't lost on her, channeling her obsessive tendencies into a legitimate career path, helping communities establish balanced governance models rather than terrorizing her own neighbors with clipboard in hand. Now, 6 months into her new role as a remote consultant, Karen was finally investing in a proper home workspace. The garden-facing spare bedroom that had once housed her extensive files on neighborhood violations was being transformed into a bright, functional office. As the last of the furniture was positioned, Karen signed the delivery form and closed the door behind the movers. The house felt different already, purposeful rather than merely perfect. A tentative knock at her front door revealed Eleanor Anderson, holding a small potted plant. Housewarming gift, Eleanor explained with a shy smile. For your new office. Marcus mentioned the renovation. Karen accepted the plant, a simple peace lily, with genuine gratitude. Would you like to see it? The office, I mean. It's still a work in progress. As she led Eleanor through the house, Karen found herself chattering nervously about her new job, about the community she was helping, about the balance between reasonable standards and livable neighborhoods. You seem different, Eleanor observed as they stood in the doorway of the new office. Karen considered this. I'm learning to channel my energies more productively, she admitted, though I still catch myself mentally citing violations when I drive through the neighborhood. Eleanor laughed, not unkindly. Old habits die hard. But speaking of the neighborhood, there's actually a reason I stopped by beyond the plant. She explained that the new, more relaxed HOA board had perhaps swung too far in the opposite direction. Maintenance of common areas was being neglected. The playground equipment, reinstalled after Karen's departure, needed safety checks. The community garden was overrun with what some called free expression and others called weeds. They're considering forming a maintenance advisory committee, Eleanor concluded. Nothing regulatory, just advisory. And your name came up. Karen froze, her hand halfway to adjusting the peace lily's position on her new desk. My name? After everything? Eleanor nodded. Marcus suggested it first, actually. Said something about nobody knows this community's bones better than Karen. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it passed. Karen sat heavily in her office chair, emotions she couldn't quite name washing over her. Not triumph, she was learning to recognize that toxic rush for what it was. Not vindication either. Something closer to belonging. I'd have to fit it around my consulting work, she said carefully. And I would only be advisory, not regulatory. Of course, Eleanor assured her. The committee meets next Tuesday. Just, maybe leave Mr. Whiskers at home this time. As Eleanor left, Karen moved to her front window, watching the everyday life of Oakwood Estates unfold beyond her meticulously maintained yard. The Paddle's daughter rode past on a bicycle with streamers that definitely violated the old acceptable recreation equipment statutes. Marcus walked Buddy without a leash in his own front yard, a former finiable offense. A new family was moving in across the street, unloading furniture that looked decidedly more IKEA than Ethan Allen. Karen felt a reflexive twinge of judgment, then consciously released it. Her hand reached for her phone, not to document violations, but to add the committee meeting to her calendar. Mr. Whiskers jumped onto the windowsill beside her, purring as she absently stroked his fur. We're adapting, she told him softly. Not changing entirely, let's not get carried away. But adapting. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the kind that would once have sent Karen scrambling to ensure all patio furniture was properly secured per Section 17 of the Outdoor Standards Manual. Instead, she simply observed their approach with qualified acceptance. Oakwood Estates would get wet, and then it would dry. The community would evolve, with or without Karen Whitfield's clipboard of citations. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a place for her expertise, tempered now with the beginnings of wisdom. She turned away from the window and toward her new office, ready to prepare for Tuesday's meeting with just one color-coded folder instead of her usual 12.